The auction wasn't for cattle or land. It was for a woman deemed worthless. In the blistering Montana sun of 1888, Abigail Hayes stood on a splintered crate, her value measured not in spirit or heart, but by the damning silence of her own body. They called her Barren. A word spat like a curse, a death sentence for a woman's place in the world. Her own father, his face a mask of stone, was the auctioneer. For $25 silver her life was sold. But the man who bought her wasn't a lecherous miner or a cruel saloon owner. He was a ghost of a man himself, a lonely rancher named Benjamin Carter, with 5 motherless children and desperation etched into every line on his face. This isn't a story about a damsel in distress. It's the story of what happens when a broken woman is given a broken family, and together they must find a way to build a home on the ashes of their pasts. The heat was a physical weight in Redemption Gulch. It pressed down on the dusty street, shimmered above the warped timber of the storefronts, and baked the very soul out of the land. For Abigail Hayes, 22 years old, the heat was nothing compared to the freezing shame that had settled deep in her bones. She stood on the makeshift auction block, 3 stacked shipping crates outside the general store, and refused to meet the eyes of the townsfolk who had known her since she was a girl. They were all there. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, whose pity was sharper than any insult. Young men who had once tried to court her, now looking away as if her condition were contagious. And her parents. Her mother Martha stood by the wall of the store, her face hidden in the shadows of her bonnet, a portrait of silent complicity. Her father, Silas Hayes, stood beside the crates, his voice usually reserved for scripture and condemnation, now ringing out with the cold clarity of a merchant. A strong back, Silas declared, his hand gesturing towards Abigail as if she were a mule. Knows how to keep a house cook and mend, obedient and God-fearing. He paused, letting the unspoken hang in the air like dust motes. He didn't need to say the word. Everyone knew why she was here. After 4 years of marriage to a farmer who had died of fever, Abigail had produced no child. In the harsh calculus of the frontier, a woman's worth was measured in sons to work the land and daughters to marry off. An empty womb was an empty promise, a failed crop. Her late husband's family had sent her back in disgrace, and her own father saw her not as a grieving daughter, but as a useless mouth to feed. "What am I bid for her contract of indenture?" Silas asked, his eyes scanning the small crowd. An indenture was a kinder word for what this was. Slavery for a set term in this case, until a man felt he'd gotten his money's worth. A grimy prospector named Finch spat a wad of tobacco near the crate. $5. She can scrub my shack. A wave of nausea rolled over Abigail. Finch was a foul man, known for his cruelty to his animals. She squeezed her hands together, her knuckles white, and stared at a loose nail on the floor of the general store's porch. She focused on its rusted head, making it the entire world a tiny, insignificant point to anchor her before she shattered. "I hear 10 from Mr. O'Connell." Silas's voice boomed. O'Connell was a widower who ran the livery, a man whose hands were always dirty and whose eyes were always hungry. The bidding crawled upward in small, humiliating increments. $12, $13.50. Each offer felt like a stone being thrown at her. She wasn't Abigail anymore. She was a commodity, a problem to be sold off. She risked a glance at her mother, a desperate, silent plea, but Martha simply wrung her hands, her gaze fixed on the ground. It was a betrayal so profound it left no room for tears. The bidding stalled at $22, offered by a trapper with a missing eye. Silas looked disappointed. He had clearly expected more for his shame. $22 going once, going twice. 25. The voice was quiet, but cut through the dry air with an authority that made every head turn. It hadn't come from the cluster of townsmen. It came from a man standing near the water trough who had been watching the entire spectacle in silence. Benjamin Carter. He was a man who seemed to be carved from the raw, hard land itself. He wasn't old, perhaps 35, but his face was a road map of hardship. His brown hair was sun-bleached, his shoulders were broad from work, not bravado, and his eyes were a startlingly clear blue, but they held a weariness that went bone-deep. He was the owner of the Whispering Pines Ranch, a sprawling property north of town that was known to be struggling since his wife Sarah had been taken by consumption 2 years prior. He was also known to be the father of 5 children. A murmur went through the crowd. What did a man with 5 children, a man drowning in his own responsibilities, want with a barren woman? Silas Hayes's eyes lit with surprise, and then greed. $25 from Mr. Carter. A fine offer from a fine man. Do I hear 30? The crowd was silent. No one would bid against Ben Carter, not out of fear, but out of a strange collective respect for his quiet suffering. He was a man who kept to himself and bothered no one. Sold Silas banged a small mallet on a barrel head. To Mr. Benjamin Carter, for $25 silver. Ben Carter didn't smile. He didn't look at Abigail with pity or lust. He simply walked forward, pulled a small leather pouch from his worn trousers, and counted out the coins into Silas Hayes's outstretched hand. The clink of the silver was the sound of her life being signed away. I'll need the indenture papers drawn up by the magistrate, Ben said to her father, his voice a low rumble. Of course, Silas said, pocketing the money with a sickening finality. He turned to Abigail, his expression devoid of any fatherly warmth. You belong to him now. You will obey him as you would obey me. Do not bring shame to his house as you brought to ours. Abigail finally looked up her gaze, meeting Ben Carter's for the first time. She expected to see a master, a purchaser. Instead, she saw a man who looked just as trapped as she felt. He gave a curt nod, not to her, but towards his wagon, a sturdy but weathered buckboard parked down the street. Get your things, he said, his voice softer than she expected, though still heavy with exhaustion. I have nothing, Abigail whispered, the words tasting like ash. Her late husband's family had kept everything. Her father had given her nothing but the simple calico dress on her back. Ben Carter's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. He looked from her to her father, a flicker of something contempt, perhaps, in his tired eyes. He gave Silas a final dismissive glance, and then turned his back on him completely. Then come, he said to Abigail. Without a word of goodbye to her parents, without a look back at the town that had condemned her, Abigail Hayes stepped down from the crates. Her legs were trembling, but she walked with her back straight, following the lonely rancher who had just purchased her body and soul for the price of a decent horse. She was leaving one prison, but she had no doubt she was simply walking into another. The journey to Whispering Pines was shrouded in a thick, oppressive silence. The rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding hoofbeats of the 2 sturdy horses were the only sounds. Abigail sat on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring straight ahead at the endless expanse of rolling hills and distant purple mountains. The landscape was beautiful in a brutal, unforgiving way, much like the man sitting beside her. Benjamin Carter did not speak. He handled the reins with an economy of motion, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was not unkind, but there was a wall around him, so high and thick that Abigail felt she could have screamed, and the sound would not have reached him. She stole glances at him. He was handsome, in a rugged, weathered way, but grief had hollowed out his cheeks and put shadows under his eyes. He looked like a man carrying the world on his shoulders, and she was just one more bundle he'd been forced to pick up. Why had he done it? The question hammered in her mind. He had 5 children to feed. $25 was a fortune. It made no sense. A widower like him needed a wife, a true wife, a woman who could give him more sons. Why waste precious money on damaged goods? The thought shamed her, but it was the truth as she knew it. After nearly 2 hours, he finally pulled the horses to a halt at the crest of a hill. "That's it," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. Abigail followed his gaze. Down in a shallow valley, nestled in a grove of tall pine trees that seemed to sigh in the wind, was the Whispering Pines Ranch. It was not the prosperous homestead she had imagined. The main house was a large 2-story timber structure, but it was in desperate need of paint, its grey wood looking tired and thirsty. A porch sagged on one side, and several shingles were missing from the roof. The barn was massive, but had a slight lean to it. Fences were mended in some places and collapsing in others. It was a place of immense potential, but it was drowning in neglect. It was the home of a man who was too busy surviving to build. As they drew closer, the front door of the house burst open, and the children spilled out onto the porch. 5 of them. They stood in a line, a small, defiant army watching the wagons approach. Ben pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down his movements, stiff. "This is Abigail," he announced to them, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth or introduction. "She'll be staying here." Abigail slid down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. She smoothed her dress and faced the jury of 5 hostile sets of eyes. The oldest was a boy of about 16, a younger, angrier version of his father. He stood with his arms crossed, his dark glare promising nothing but trouble. Next to him was a girl, maybe 14, with long braided hair, and her mother's weary eyes. She held the hand of a tiny girl with blonde curls who couldn't have been more than 5 and was hiding behind her sister's skirt. 2 boys, somewhere between 8 and 10, stood a little apart, fidgeting with nervous energy, their faces smudged with dirt. "She's not Mama." The oldest boy said, his voice cracking with adolescent fury. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "No, Samuel, she's not," Ben said tiredly, not looking at his son. "Her name is Abigail. She'll be helping with the house." "We don't need help," Samuel shot back. "The hell we don't," Ben muttered, turning to unhitch the horses. "Clara, show her. Show her the spare room." The 14-year-old girl, Clara, gave Abigail a look that was a mixture of resentment and exhaustion. She knew what this new woman's arrival meant: more work for her, trying to teach a stranger the rhythms of a house that was already falling apart. "This way," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. Abigail followed her onto the sagging porch and through the front door. The inside of the house was like the outside, large and once loved, but now sinking into chaos. A fine layer of dust coated everything. Dishes were piled by the dry sink. Mismatched boots and children's toys littered the floor. The air was thick with the smell of stale bread and something vaguely sour. It was a house without a woman's touch, a home without a heart. It was a house full of ghosts, and the most prominent one was Sarah Carter. Her presence was in the faded floral curtains, in a half-finished piece of embroidery left in a basket by the hearth, in the very arrangement of the furniture. Clara led her up a creaking staircase to a small room at the back of the house. It was little more than a closet with a narrow cot, a small washstand, and a single window looking out over a tangled, overgrown vegetable garden. "This is it," Clara said, her hand on the doorknob, eager to escape. "Thank you, Clara," Abigail said softly. The girl just shrugged and turned to leave, but hesitated. "Supper is at sundown." If there is any, she added a bitter edge to her voice before hurrying back down the stairs. Left alone, Abigail sank onto the lumpy cot. The springs groaned in protest. This was her new life. An unwanted housekeeper, a purchased servant in a house of grieving strangers who hated her for the one simple reason she could not control: she was not Sarah. She looked around the bare room. There were no bars on the window, but it felt more like a cell than any jail she could imagine. She had been sold for being barren, for her inability to create life. Now she had been dropped into a home, teeming with it, 5 children who needed a mother they could never have again, and a man who needed a wife he could never replace. The irony was so cruel, so sharp, it felt like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around herself, not to ward off a chill, but to keep from flying apart. The first few weeks at Whispering Pines were a special kind of hell. Abigail learned that silence could be a weapon, and the Carter children wielded it with expert precision. They moved around her like she was a piece of furniture, speaking to her only when absolutely necessary, their answers clipped and sullen. Her days began before sunrise and ended long after dark, a blur of thankless, grueling labor. The house was a beast to be tamed. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, beat dust from rugs until her arms ached, and waged a relentless war against the grime that had claimed every corner. She found Sarah Carter's recipe book, its pages stained and soft with use, and tried to recreate the meals the children once loved. Her first attempt at beef stew was a disaster, tough, watery, and bland. She served it in silence, placing a bowl before each child. The 2 middle boys, Luke and Thomas, poked at it with their spoons before pushing their bowls away. Clara ate a few bites, her face impassive. Little Rose, the youngest, just stared at it, her bottom lip trembling. It was Samuel who broke the silence. He took 1 spoonful, chewed it slowly, and then deliberately spat it back into his bowl. "Tastes like boiled leather," he said, his eyes locking with Abigail's in a cold challenge. Mama's stew was better. The words meant to wound hit their mark, but they also ignited a spark of defiance in Abigail. She had been silent for too long, first in her father's house, then in the town square, and now here. She met Samuel's glare, her own eyes steady. "I am not your mother," she said, her voice quiet but firm, slicing through the tension. "Your mother is gone. This is what there is. Eat it or go hungry." Samuel's face flushed with anger. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "I'd rather starve." He stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the back door behind him. Ben, who had been eating his own portion without complaint, sighed heavily. He looked at Abigail, then at his remaining children. "Sam," he called out, his voice weary. But the boy was gone. He rubbed his face, the picture of a man defeated. He didn't scold Abigail. He didn't defend his son. He just finished his stew, every last drop, as if to make a point that Abigail couldn't quite decipher. The incident set the tone. Abigail was the outsider, the usurper. The younger boys, Luke and Thomas, took their cues from Samuel, playing cruel tricks on her. They hid her cleaning rags, put a garter snake in the laundry basket, and tracked mud through the house, moments after she had finished mopping. Clara remained distant, a ghost in her own home, burdened with the responsibilities of a mother without any of the authority. She saw Abigail not as an ally, but as a rival for control over the domestic sphere she had been forced to command. Only little Rose showed any sign of cracking. The 5-year-old would sometimes watch Abigail from a doorway, her thumb in her mouth, her wide, curious blue eyes following Abigail's every move. She was too young to understand the complexities of the situation. She only knew that her world was broken, and this new, quiet woman was now a part of it. A breakthrough, small and fragile, came one afternoon. Abigail was in the overgrown garden, trying to salvage what she could from the choking weeds. Her hands were caked with dirt, her back screaming in protest. She had found a small patch of wild strawberries, miraculously thriving amidst the neglect. Carefully she picked the few ripe ones, placing them in her apron pocket. Later she saw Rose, sitting on the porch steps, trying to rebraid the yarn hair of a worn-out rag doll. Her small fingers fumbled, and she let out a frustrated sigh. Abigail approached slowly, so as not to startle her. She sat down on the step below Rose, not saying a word. She took the strawberries from her pocket. "I found these," she said softly. "They're very sweet." She held one out. Rose hesitated, her eyes flicking from the berry to Abigail's face, and then back again. Slowly she reached out her tiny hand and took it. She popped it in her mouth, her cheeks puffing out. A small, sweet smile touched her lips. "More," she whispered. Abigail gave her the rest. They sat there together, sharing the small, sweet treasure in the fading afternoon light. Then Rose held up her doll. "Her hair's a mess." "May I?" Abigail asked gently. Rose nodded and handed over the doll. With nimble fingers, Abigail undid the tangled yarn and carefully rebraided it, tying it off with a piece of twine she found on the porch. She handed the doll back. Rose hugged it tightly, then looked at Abigail, a real, genuine smile lighting up her face. It was the first smile Abigail had seen in this house. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't acceptance. But it was a start, a tiny seed of connection planted in the barren soil of the Carter family. That night, as she lay on her narrow cot, Abigail allowed herself a sliver of hope. She had been bought to be a drudge, a servant. But maybe maybe she could be something more. She hadn't been able to grow a child in her own body, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could learn to cultivate a broken garden and a broken family. The fragile peace, brought by a handful of strawberries, was shattered a week later by the arrival of a man who moved with the predatory grace of a coyote. He rode a magnificent black stallion that was a stark contrast to the work-worn horses of Whispering Pines. The man himself was dressed in a tailored coat and a clean, wide-brimmed hat. He was handsome, but his smile didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He dismounted and strode onto the porch as if he owned it. "Carter," he called out, his voice smooth and confident. Ben emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His face, already etched with worry, darkened into a thunderous scowl. "Monroe," he said the name, tasting like poison. "Benjamin, my friend, the man Clayton Monroe," said with false bonhomie. "Just checking on my investment. Things look rustic as always." His eyes swept over the peeling paint and sagging fence with disdain. Then his gaze landed on Abigail, who had come to the doorway. His smile widened. "Well, well, you finally got yourself some help, and a pretty one at that." "This is Abigail," Ben said, his voice a low warning. "She works for me. State your business and get off my land." Monroe chuckled a dry, unpleasant sound. He pulled a ledger from his saddlebag. "Business it is. You're 3 months behind on your loan payment, Ben. You know my terms. The interest compounds. At this rate, I'll own this pile of sticks and dirt by Christmas." Abigail's heart went cold. A loan. So that was it. The ranch wasn't just struggling. It was on the verge of being lost. The $25 Ben had spent on her suddenly seemed like an act of profound foolishness or desperate madness. The herd was thin this spring, Ben said, his fists clenching at his sides. The market in Miles City is paying rock bottom. I'll have the money. You always say that. Monroe replied, his voice losing its friendly veneer. He stepped closer to Ben, lowering his voice to a menacing purr. I knew your father, Ben. He was a proud man. He'd be ashamed to see his son running his legacy into the ground. And your dear Sarah. He let the name hang in the air. She loved this place. A tragedy what happened. A real tragedy. It would be a bigger one to see her children thrown off their own land. The mention of Sarah was a deliberate cruelty. Ben's body went rigid. For a moment, Abigail thought he would lunge at Monroe, but he held himself back, the effort costing him dearly. Monroe's eyes flicked back to Abigail. Perhaps your new help can earn her keep in more profitable ways. I'd be willing to renegotiate your terms for the right kind of company. Before Abigail could even react to the vile suggestion, Ben moved with a speed that was shocking. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and grabbed the front of Monroe's expensive coat. You will not speak to her, he snarled, his face inches from Monroe's. You will not look at her. Get off my property. Now. Monroe, surprised by the sudden violence, held up his hands in mock surrender. Easy, Carter. No need for unpleasantness. I'll be back at the end of the month. Have my money, or have your wagon packed. Ben shoved him backward. Monroe stumbled, regained his composure, and shot Ben a look of pure hatred. He mounted his horse, gave Abigail one last lingering look that made her skin crawl, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. Ben stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, staring at the spot where Monroe had been. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking older and more broken than ever. That evening the house was quieter than usual. The confrontation had cast a long shadow. After the children were in bed, Abigail found Ben sitting on the porch steps, staring out into the darkness. The pines whispered their secrets to the night sky. She brought him a cup of coffee, holding it out to him. He looked up surprised and took it. "Thank you," he mumbled. She sat on the step above him, wrapping her arms around her knees. For a long time they just sat in the companionable silence of 2 people who were too tired for words. "He owns the bank in town," Ben said finally, his voice rough. "And most of the politicians. My father borrowed from him years ago to expand the ranch. A mistake. Monroe's been circling ever since Dad died, waiting for me to fail. Is it as bad as he says?" Abigail asked quietly. Ben let out a bitter laugh. "It's worse. Sarah. Her sickness took everything we had. The doctors, the medicines from back east. I sold off half our breeding stock just to give her a few more months of comfort." His voice cracked on his wife's name. "This ranch is all I have left of them. My father. Her. It's all I have to give these kids." He took a long drink of coffee. "Buying you," he said, not looking at her. "It was a fool's move. I know that. I was in town to try and beg the bank for an extension. I saw your father. What he was doing. I saw your face." He shook his head. "I don't know. I couldn't let Finch or one of those other vultures have you. It felt like one more piece of ugliness in a world that's already full of it. So I spent the last of my cash on an act of foolish pride." Abigail's throat felt tight. He hadn't bought her because he needed a servant. He hadn't even really thought it through. He had bought her out of a flicker of decency he probably thought he could no longer afford. He had seen a fellow soul trapped in a cage, and for a moment had decided to open the door, even if it meant weakening the walls of his own prison. "It wasn't foolish," she whispered. He finally turned to look at her, his tired blue eyes meeting hers in the moonlight. For the first time, she didn't feel like his property. He wasn't her master, and she wasn't his servant. They were just two people, Benjamin and Abigail, adrift on the same sea of debt and despair. The garden, she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. The one behind the house. It's overgrown, but the soil is good. Sarah. She planted herbs there. I recognize some of them. For medicine. If I can get it cleared, we can grow enough to feed ourselves through the winter. It would save money at the general store. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had been so consumed by the big picture, the loan, the cattle, the crushing weight of it all, that he had overlooked the small things. It's a start, he said, a hint of something that wasn't quite hope, but was no longer despair in his voice. Yes, Abigail agreed, looking out at the vast, dark land that was threatening to swallow them whole. It's a start. Autumn bled into winter with a sudden, brutal efficiency. The golden leaves of the aspens were stripped away by a fierce November wind, and the sky turned a permanent, menacing shade of pewter. The threat of Clayton Monroe loomed, but it was a distant storm cloud compared to the immediate, terrifying reality of the first blizzard. It came without warning. One afternoon, the air grew unnaturally still and heavy, and by dusk, the first flakes were spiraling down. By morning, Whispering Pines was entombed in a world of white. The snow was already waist-deep and showed no signs of stopping. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and driving snow through every crack and crevice in the old house. They were trapped. The first day was a novelty for the younger children, but by the third day, fear and claustrophobia began to set in. The house felt smaller, the silence heavier, punctuated only by the shrieking wind. Wood for the fire was a constant concern, requiring dangerous, bundled-up trips to the woodpile. Food had to be rationed. The crisis came on the fourth night. 8-year-old Thomas woke up with a deep, barking cough that echoed through the silent house. By morning, he was burning with fever, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. It's croup, Ben said, his face pale with a terror Abigail recognized. It was the same fear he must have felt watching his wife fade away, just like Sarah had at the end. It is not the same, Abigail said, her voice sharp with an authority that surprised them both. She placed a hand on Thomas's forehead. He was slick with sweat. We need to break the fever and help him breathe. While Ben paced helplessly, a ghost of his past trauma haunting his every step, Abigail took command. All the resentment and distance in the house evaporated in the face of a common enemy. Clara, I need more blankets and as many clean rags as you can find. Samuel, you are strong. I need you to keep the fire in the hearth roaring, but also one in the stove. We need to keep the kettle boiling. Luke, your job is to stay with your brother. Talk to him. Tell him stories. Keep him from being scared. The children, even Samuel, stared at her, then at their father, who simply nodded his eyes, trusting Abigail in a way he hadn't before. For the first time, they weren't Ben's children and his purchased woman. They were a single unit, fighting for one of their own. Abigail went to the pantry. All summer and fall she had worked in the garden she had reclaimed. She had not only grown vegetables which were now stored in the root cellar, but she had carefully cultivated and dried the herbs Sarah had planted long ago. Her own mother, for all her weakness, had taught her about herbs and folk remedies. Now that knowledge was their only hope. She gathered dried mullein for the cough yarrow to fight the fever and peppermint to help open his airways. She steeped them in boiling water, the fragrant steam filling the small, tense kitchen. She spent the next 48 hours at Thomas's side. She coaxed the warm, bitter tea down his throat. She wrapped his small body in blankets and held him close, whispering reassurances. She created a steam tent over his head with a sheet and a bowl of boiling water infused with mint, forcing him to breathe in the healing vapor. Ben stayed nearby, his face a mask of worry, fetching water, and Wood a silent, grateful sentinel. The other children moved about the house with a new quiet purpose. The turning point came on the 6th day. The blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. In the pre-dawn light, Abigail felt a change in the small body she was holding. Thomas's breathing was deeper, less ragged. His fever had broken. The skin on his forehead was cool and damp. He stirred and opened his eyes. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm hungry." Tears of pure relief streamed down Abigail's face. Ben, who had been asleep in a chair by the fire, rushed to the bedside. He put his hand on his son's head, then looked at Abigail, his eyes shining with an emotion so profound it needed no words. He simply reached out and squeezed her hand, a gesture of gratitude and respect that meant more than any coin. Later that day, Samuel found her in the kitchen, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. He stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "The firewood is getting low," he said. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a challenge either. It was a statement of fact, an offering of partnership. "I know," she replied. "Your father and I were just talking about it." He nodded, then shifted his weight. "That stuff you made him drink. The herbs. My mother used to do that." He paused. You knew which ones to use." It was the closest he could come to saying thank you. It was an admission that she wasn't just a replacement, but that she possessed her own skills, her own worth. She had not replaced his mother, but she had saved his brother. "Your mother planted a very good garden," Abigail said softly. From that day on, something fundamental shifted in the House of Ghosts. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was just quiet. The children no longer looked through her, but at her. Sam still didn't smile, but the anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. Clara began asking her questions about cooking, about mending. Luke and Thomas stopped their pranks, and little Rose now followed her everywhere, a small blonde shadow. Abigail had been sold because her body had failed to produce a child. But in the crucible of the blizzard, under the siege of the howling white wind, she had birthed a family. The thaw came both in the weather and in the heart of the Carter household. The snow melted, feeding the creeks and turning the land a vibrant, hopeful green. But as the physical siege ended, the other more insidious one returned. Clayton Munro had not forgotten them. His next move was not a direct confrontation, but something far more cunning. Whispering Pines relied on Sage Creek for its water, a stream that flowed down from the hills through Munro's vast property before reaching the Carter land. One morning, the creek slowed to a trickle. By afternoon, it was a muddy, stagnant ditch. Ben and Samuel rode up the valley to investigate. They returned hours later, their faces grim. Munro had built a dam, a crude but effective barrier of rock and timber, diverting the entirety of Sage Creek into a new reservoir for his own cattle. It was perfectly legal he owned the land the dam was on, and it was a death sentence for Whispering Pines. Without water, the cattle would die, the garden would wither, and the ranch would fail. Munro hadn't even needed to foreclose. He was simply starving them out. Despair, thick and choking, descended on the ranch again. Ben sat at the kitchen table that night, his head in his hands. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "He's won. I can't fight him. We'll have to sell. Take whatever he offers and move on." "No," a voice said, firm and clear. Everyone turned to look at Abigail. She was standing by the hearth, her face set with a determination they had never seen before. The woman who had stood silently on the auction block was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced down death in a blizzard and refused to blink. "We are not selling," she said. "We are not running." "Abigail, you don't understand," Ben said, looking up, his eyes full of defeat. "There's nothing to be done. The law is on his side." "Then we look beyond the law of men like Monroe," she replied. She went to a dusty wooden chest in the corner, a chest filled with old papers and memories that Ben hadn't been able to bring himself to touch since Sarah died. "Your father's papers. The original deed to this land." "Where is it?" Confused, Ben pointed to the chest. Abigail knelt and began carefully sifting through the contents, old letters bills of sale for livestock Sarah's drawings, and at the very bottom, a thick vellum document tied with a faded ribbon. The original land grant for Whispering Pines, signed decades ago. For the rest of the night, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Abigail read. Her own father, for all his cruelty, had been a meticulous man who had taught her to read and write, insisting she understand contracts and scripture in equal measure. He believed knowledge was a tool of control. Now Abigail would use it as a tool of liberation. Her eyes scanned the dense, spidery script, the arcane legal language of a bygone era. Ben and the older children watched her, a sliver of hope, warring with years of resignation. The hours ticked by. Finally, just as the first grey light of dawn touched the sky, she looked up, a fierce, triumphant light in her eyes. Here she said, her finger tracing a line of faded ink. "It's called a prior appropriation doctrine. It's an old water rights clause. It states that the first person to take a quantity of water from a source for beneficial use has the right to continue to use that same quantity of water for that same purpose. Your father's grant predates Monroe's by 20 years. He established the right to the water from Sage Creek for agricultural use." She looked at Ben, her voice ringing with conviction. "He can't dam that creek, Ben. He has the right to the land, but you have the right to the water that flows through it. The law is on our side, the older law." The next day, Ben and Abigail rode into Redemption Gulch. They didn't go to the bank or to Monroe's office. They went straight to the magistrate, a weary old man named Judge Miller. Ben, armed with a newfound confidence borrowed from Abigail, explained the situation. Abigail, calm and resolute, laid the old deed on the judge's desk and pointed to the clause. Judge Miller read it, then read it again, his eyebrows rising. He looked from the deed to the determined face of the woman standing before him. He had been at the auction. He had seen her sold like chattel. Now here she was, quoting land law like a Philadelphia lawyer. Word spread through town like wildfire. A showdown was brewing. That afternoon, Judge Miller, Ben, and Abigail rode out to the dam, followed by a curious contingent of other small ranchers and townsfolk who had long chafed under Monroe's thumb. Monroe was there overseeing his men. He laughed when he saw the small posse. "Come to beg Carter Miller. This is my land." "You know the law." "I do," the judge said, holding up the deed. "And this document states that you are illegally obstructing a vested water right belonging to the Whispering Pines Ranch. I am ordering you to dismantle this dam, immediately." Monroe's face turned purple with rage. "That's an ancient, dusty piece of paper. It means nothing. It means everything," Abigail said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet valley. "It is the law of this land, not just the law you choose to buy." The other ranchers murmured in agreement. They saw a chance for the first time to stand up to the man who was slowly strangling them all. Monroe looked at the determined faces of his neighbors, at the resolute judge, and at the quiet woman who had somehow engineered his defeat. He was beaten not by force of arms, but by a force he had never respected a woman's intelligence and a scrap of old paper. He spat on the ground. "This isn't over, Carter," he seethed before turning to his men. "Tear it down." As the first rocks were pulled away and a trickle of water began to flow back into the bed of Sage Creek, Ben Carter looked at Abigail. He saw not the barren woman he had purchased out of pity, but the architect of their salvation. She had saved his son's life with her knowledge of herbs, and now she had saved his family's future with her knowledge of the law. She had given him back his hope, something he thought he had buried with his wife. The water began to flow, and for Benjamin Carter, it felt like the whole world was coming back to life. The victory over Clayton Monroe changed everything. It wasn't just about the water. It was about the restoration of dignity. The story of Abigail and the old deed became a local legend, a tale of how David, armed with ink and wit, had bested Goliath. For the first time, when Abigail went into town for supplies, people didn't look at her with pity or scorn. They looked at her with respect. She was no longer the barren woman from the auction block. She was the matron of Whispering Pines. At the ranch, the change was even more profound. The flow of the water seemed to wash away the last vestiges of grief and resentment that had stained the family. The sound of laughter, once a rarity, became a daily occurrence. Luke and Thomas taught Abigail how to skip stones on the now full creek. Clara, seeing that Abigail was a partner and not a replacement, began to share stories about her mother, not as a way to wound, but as a way to remember. She and Abigail would sit on the porch in the evenings, mending clothes together, their conversation easy and familiar. Samuel, the last holdout, finally surrendered his anger. He started seeking Abigail's opinion on matters concerning the ranch, from mending fences to rotating pastures. He had stopped seeing her as an intruder and started seeing her as the glue that was holding them all together. Life settled into a new, hopeful rhythm. The garden, watered and tended by Abigail, and the children flourished. The cattle grew fat and healthy. The house, once a dusty shell, was filled with the smells of baking bread and the warmth of a family rediscovering itself. Abigail had found her purpose, not in her womb, but in her hands, her heart, and her mind. She had cultivated a home. One evening in late summer, as the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the valley, Abigail was sitting on the porch steps, watching the children play a game of tag in the yard. She felt a quiet contentment that she had never known in her life. Ben came and sat beside her. He didn't speak for a while, just watched the scene with her. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady calm. "I went to see the magistrate today," he said, finally. Abigail's heart gave a small, anxious flutter. "Oh, I had him draw up some papers." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to her. "The indenture contract, the one I signed with your father. I had him nullify it. It's void. You are a free woman, Abigail. You are not bound to this place or to me." He then handed her another document. This one is the deed to the ranch. I've had it amended. It's now in the name of Benjamin Carter and Abigail Hayes. Half of this ranch, this land, this house, it's yours. Legally. No one can ever take it from you." Abigail stared at the papers, her vision blurring with tears. She was speechless. "I bought an indentured servant for $25, Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to face her fully. "But that's not what I got. I got a partner. You saved my son. You saved my home. You saved me from the ghost I was becoming." He reached out and gently took her hand. His was calloused and rough from work, but his touch was tender. I know I'm not. I know I can never replace what you lost or give you the one thing the world told you that you were supposed to have. But this family, it wouldn't be a family without you. These children, they love you." He took a deep breath. "I know I do." Abigail looked from his earnest, hopeful face to the 5 children chasing fireflies in the twilight. Samuel, Clara, Luke, Thomas, and little Rose, her children. Not of her body, but of her heart. She had arrived at Whispering Pines, a barren woman, sold and shamed. But in this broken place, with this broken family, she had found her harvest. It wasn't the harvest of the womb, but the harvest of the soul. "This is my home, Ben," she whispered, her tears finally falling. "I'm not going anywhere." He smiled, a true warm smile that reached his clear blue eyes, and squeezed her hand. On the porch of the ranch, that was now half hers, surrounded by the family she had made her own, Abigail Hayes was finally truly free. Abigail Hayes's story reminds us that a person's worth is never defined by what they cannot do, but by the courage and love they choose to give. She was sold for being barren, a woman deemed incomplete, only to prove that a family is not built by blood alone, but by grit, resilience, and the fierce determination to cultivate love in the most broken of soils. She didn't bear children, but she raised a family. She didn't inherit a home, but she built one. Her journey from the auction block to the heart of Whispering Pines is a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit in the unforgiving landscape of the Old West. If Abigail's story of strength and found family moved you, please help us share more tales like this by hitting the like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story of true grit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a journey back in time to the dramas that shaped the American frontier. Thank you for listening.